Greetings from Tokyo. My name is Daisuke Beppu, and today I'd like to talk about a very important film and a very critical film in the Criterion Collection. It is Spine 663, and the title of the film is Shoah. So, from the outset, I should mention very quickly that I'm very nervous about speaking about this film because it is a very, it is a film that is of a subject matter that is quite serious and very deserving of great attention and care and respect when talking about it, and my own personal opinion. So therefore, it's with some trepidation that I embark upon this particular video. However, I do think that the film is very significant and very important to talk about, even if it's in a very introductory way, or even, and I don't mean this in a bad way, in a very superficial way, because I think it's very important, rather than avoid talking about a film like Shoah. I think it is, on the contrary, quite important to keep it alive in the conversation and to make sure that people watch it and people react to it and respond to it and hopefully discuss it and maybe become more inspired to learn about it or learn from it or something of that nature. Now, I don't expect everyone to like this film or love this film if they've watched it. On the contrary, I think it can be quite challenging in some places in a way that perhaps I'd like to talk about later on in this video. However, I do think that it is very important for people to watch this film at least once. It's important because of the very simple fact that the subject matter is quite important, and it's something that I don't think is well, let me put it this way. I think it's one of those films that it's about a subject matter that I think we all should be aware of, at least to a certain degree. And while we may not necessarily all be students of Holocaust studies, it is certainly a subject matter that is quite important to us living in the 21st century today. And therefore, having a film like Shoah is quite, we're quite fortunate, I think, to have a film like Shoah and to be able to see it, because, without a film like Shoah, as hopefully I try to talk about later, the idea of witness to history becomes quite problematic. So without a film like Shoah, so therefore the fact that Shoah exists is a miracle in and of itself, and therefore it should be celebrated. And of course, the best way to celebrate a film is to watch it and to appreciate it accordingly. So therefore, I think people should watch Shoah if possible. I know it's a long film, and it might be quite intimidating to some people, but it is the most important film in the Criterion Collection, and I think anyone who, anyone who is an admirer of the Criterion Collection and who likes to collect the Criterion Collection films, I think we owe it to the subject matter of Shoah and to the memory of that subject matter to give this our attention. And so therefore I with humble respect, I would highly suggest that people watch this film and seek it out and watch it and give it a chance if you haven't seen it already. And when you do watch it, please be sure you give it the attention that it deserves. It's quite a difficult film, and it requires a certain amount of attention. Now, I think for some people it's very difficult to follow because the subject matter is quite vast. So I would suggest from the outset, if you're going to watch this film, maybe you should first of all, if you're going to get the Criterion Collection release, the Criterion Collection has a nice little booklet which has, amongst other things, pictures of what is known as the key witnesses. Now, I guess my only, I think this is great because this gives you like pictures of people and their names, so you can use this as a little bit of a guide as you watch the film. I would say probably my only, well, here, no, actually, I take that back. Here, and then here is a guide for the chapters. In other words, a pictorial guide showing you each chapter and what is going on, and a brief little summary of what's going on and what the discussion or the topic is. So this is actually quite helpful to use as a guide when you are watching the film, especially if you, like me, if you're not a student of Holocaust studies or World War II history per se. So that's one suggestion that I have when you try to tackle this film. Another suggestion I have is, it's actually, if you can get the complete text of the film. This is actually a book which is setting forth basically the transcript of the film, the entire transcript in English. So it's a very good read to use. It's maybe as a guide, but also as a way to revisit the subject matter of the film. And you can use this and follow along, and maybe you can, if you stop the film and you want to recall a particular scenario or something that was discussed, you can rely on this and read it and try to see who is talking about what particular episode. This is actually quite useful to have, and I highly suggest that one gets a copy of the complete text of the acclaimed Holocaust film Shoah. This is very helpful as a supplement to this. Of course, it doesn't come with the Criterion Collection release, unfortunately, but I highly suggest that you get a copy of this when you watch the film Shoah. Another suggestion I have is probably, if you get this book, which is Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, Key Essays, edited by Stuart Liebman. Now, this is a very interesting book because it has a number of essays, some of which were written by Lanzmann himself. Some of them are not essays, but for example, a famous interview that Lanzmann did with Cahiers du Cinéma. There's also an essay written by the editor Stuart Liebman himself, as well as some other essays. For example, the head of New Yorker Films, writing an essay about the background surrounding the release of the film in the United States. It's actually quite fascinating, as well as an essay by Jan Karski. There is also, I should say, there are some very interesting essays here. There's one essay in particular that I think is really interesting, which is called, by Jean-Charles Churek, which is called Shoah, From the Jewish Question to the Polish Question, which is an essay about the issues regarding what's known as the quote-unquote Polish question, or how the Polish people, as depicted in the film, were treated, and how that depiction, if anything, suggests something about the Polish people and Poland during World War II. The way that the author describes it is the Poland as a witness country. So this is a very interesting essay, especially in the context of, there's this whole generalized critique of Shoah. Some people think that Claude Lanzmann, in his depiction or his addressing or choosing of certain Polish people to interview and to include in the final cut of the film, somehow paints a picture of Poland which is inherently anti-Semitic and not very sympathetic to the plight of the Jewish people. So that issue is sort of at the heart of this essay, and actually I don't quite prescribe to that view in a way that perhaps hopefully might be made clear later in this video. But anyway, that's just an example of why I think this is a really interesting book to have as a springboard, and also to provide further context into these very complex issues. There's also a great essay by Marianne Hirsch and Leo Spitzer called Gendered Translations, Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, which addresses another issue which I think is a really key critique of the film, namely how Claude Lanzmann handles female witnesses and female participants with respect to the subject matter of the Holocaust, which is the subject matter of this particular film, Shoah. And you probably have a general sense that women as people being depicted giving testimony or being interviewed are actually quite few in number, and I'm not sure exactly why that is, and the authors of this essay seem to accept the possibility that such an approach can be deemed to be a critique of the film. Perhaps it's something I'd like to bring up later if we have time. But that's just another example of why this book is actually quite a good springboard. It also, hopefully, if you're interested in further pursuit of Holocaust studies in the context of Shoah, this will give you a nice springboard to other places that you can go using the bibliography and other sources cited. It doesn't have anything written by, for example, by Shoshana Feldman, but I suggest that one should try to look for Shoshana Feldman's essays on Shoah, for example, in an era of testimony, Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, and others. That would be, yes, Shoshana Feldman's works are cited in the bibliography materials here, but they're not included in this book. Anyway, that's just a general kind of preliminary comments about how one, I think, should approach Shoah. And there's one other thing I should mention. This is a very long film. This is about, let me just give you the exact number, 566 minutes of a film that was released first in 1985. So this is approximately 9.5 hours, and it's divided into two parts. Part 1 and Part 2. So Part 1 is known as the first era, and then Part 2 is known as the second era. So each part is about 4 hours and 30 minutes, 5 hours about. So that is one way to approach the film, namely focusing on the first part and focusing on the second part, or the first era, and the second era. And the flow of the film is such that there is a general flow. It is not necessarily a kind of a random selection of people randomly edited together. No. There's quite a specific structure to the film and the way in which the participants are presented in the order of the edited sequence. So it's not as though it's very difficult to stop in one place. No, on the contrary, I think the film it lends itself very nicely to stopping and taking a break if you're watching this at home, for example, on this Blu-ray. However, it's probably if it's at all possible, I would highly recommend trying to find some time to just focus on the film. And if you can't do it in one sitting, try at least to do it in two sittings, the first era sitting and the second era sitting. And hopefully that might give you a general impression, because one of the key points of Shoah and the viewing of Shoah, I think, is getting an overall impression of what the Holocaust is. And what I mean by an overall impression is because one gets it's very clear when one sees the whole picture that this is lending itself to, of course, the thesis, which is now, I think, generally accepted, about the Nazi approach to the annihilation of the European Jewish population. And this was not a random uncontrolled thing. On the contrary, it was very systematic and well planned and well thought out, and you get the whole synthesis and the combined nature of everything comprehensively considered from a distance. When you think of the participants, all of them who are interviewed in Shoah, and you get the whole picture about this is a systematic approach to the destruction of a people, which is a very important aspect to keep in mind when considering this general point of Holocaust studies. So therefore, that's why I think it's important to look at it, as a whole, or at least as to the extent that you are able to, given the amount of time. And of course, in our daily lives, I think 9.5 hours is quite long, and we are all very busy. But at the same time, what's presented here in this film is something quite historic and horrible and horrific. And the fact that there are survivors who at the time of filming were able to relay this information and tell us their stories is quite remarkable when one thinks about it. And it's perhaps nothing short of miraculous. And therefore, it's probably, with that kind of thing in mind, this idea of, it's just, this film, it's amazing that it was able to be made in the first place. So with that kind of feeling of awe, then at least from my point of view, it's a lot easier for me to try to give it as much time as possible, because it's a film that I think it demands that I take the time to give it the respect that it's due. Let me put it that way. So in that regard, I think that giving 9 hours of my life to watching this film, I think is not something that is at all. I mean, it's in the grand scheme of things, that's very little. So I think it's thinking of it in that way, I think it's very it's not impossible for me to take 9 hours of my life and use it to watch this remarkable film, which is Shoah. So, with that in mind, let's just go forward with a general discussion of Shoah. So from the outset, we should talk about what the film is about, right? So the film Shoah is a film about... It's a film about death. That's it. It's a film about death. It's a discussion of death, and death in a particular context, is it not? Which is the death within the context of World War II, but more specific than that, within the context of what is known as the Holocaust, or the Nazi efforts to annihilate and eradicate the European Jewish population during World War II. And so therefore, when I say the film is about death, actually I'm not quite accurate, because this idea of death is something that's very important to keep in mind. The ordinary notion of death is something that, for example, if one dies, there is something that's left behind. There is a record of existence that's left behind usually. One's belongings are still there. One's sort of corporeal presence is still there. And maybe one's family or friends are still there as a memory. And there is one's belongings and one's estate, etc. So, in other words, there is the residue of a life that was once lived that is still there, and the memory. So death is something that once it occurs still leaves something behind. So in that context, if you have death as a meaning in that ordinary sense, then it's very interesting, because Shoah is actually not about that kind of death. No. Shoah is about a different kind of death. Shoah is about a death that means total annihilation. It's death total death. And what I mean by that is it's a death that is something which is meant to eradicate one's existence, not only in a physical form, but also one's record of existence. And this is quite frightening because it's this idea of erasing any record or trace of how one lived, and in particular the last moments of one's life. And the reason why that is because we have accounts given by certain people in Shoah which tell us that this is how death was meted out. People were either, let's say, they were gassed or they were shot, and then the bodies were burned or put into some kind of crematorium and then reduced to ash and just dust. And there is nothing that remains, and all of their belongings become, they are confiscated and they are exploited by the Nazis. So all of what remains of that person, that individual that once was alive, who is now dead, is no longer there because the person is now dead, and also all traces of his or her existence are gone. Now that is total annihilation, and that is the kind of death that is being spoken of here in Shoah, which is a completely different kind of death than the ordinary sense of it that you and I might think it means. So that's something that is very important to keep in mind. Shoah is about a very special and terrifying type of death. And it's specifically talking about the context of the treatment of the Jewish population, and it takes certain aspects of the Holocaust. Now, it's not meant to be a comprehensive documentary about the entire history, an encyclopedic history of the Holocaust. No, on the contrary, it takes certain aspects of the Holocaust and certain years. I think specifically around the years 1941, 1942 through to about 1943, 1944. So around that period. And it doesn't talk about the liberation of the camps. It doesn't talk about the end of the war. It doesn't talk about the aftermath. It doesn't talk about the aftermath of the war in the Jewish state. It doesn't talk about the build up to the war. It doesn't talk about the various the various things that were put in place by Nazi Germany with respect to the Jewish population, which incidentally is set forth very nicely and very astutely in Raoul Hilberg's book, The Destruction of the European Jews, which is a very interesting read with respect to the systematic build-up of the treatment of the Jewish population from the rise of Hitler all the way to the Wannsee Conference and the final solution. So you have the implementation of certain laws which stripped the Jewish population of rights and created a certain caste system whereby certain people of a certain Jewish background were treated in a different way than other people of a Jewish background. People who married to a Jewish person versus people who had two parents who were Jewish, etc. So these are all very different kinds of laws were implemented, different kinds of programs were implemented in Germany, and so therefore this is all covered very methodically in Raoul Hilberg's book, which is the student edition, by the way. But this is all to say that this is not the subject of Shoah. Shoah is not meant to be understood to be a comprehensive guide or historical guide to the entirety of the Holocaust from beginning to end. On the contrary, it focuses on certain key aspects of the Holocaust within a certain time frame, roughly 1941, 1942 to roughly 1943, 1944. And it focuses on certain places. most of its focus is on the areas of Poland that were affected by, in particular, Operation Reinhardt. So we're talking about specific areas of Poland during the war. And those specific areas are Belzec and Treblinka and Sobibor and also Auschwitz. Okay. As well as other places and villages surrounding certain areas, and also Helmno, and also certain areas around those places. And when we're talking about these places, then what happens is that the film gives us testimonies of people and participants and witnesses who have some kind of connection with one of these places. So, for example, the film opens very memorably with one of the two survivors of the Chelmno extermination camp, which his name is Simon Shrebnik. Now, he is the gentleman who is he opens the film. The film opens with a very detailed description of Mr. Simon Shrebnik and his background. Claude Lanzmann invites him to join him to return to the site, the Chelmno site, and we get his testimony and his reactions and his recollections about the Chelmno extermination camp. And therefore, and from there we get the progression of various people who were involved in one way or another with the Holocaust. So we get the other survivor of the of Chelmno, which is Mordecai Podschlepnik, and he has the memorable passage about I think Claude Lanzmann asks him at one point, why does he smile all the time? And he very nobly responds back, what do you expect me to do? Do you expect me to cry? And sometimes you smile, sometimes you cry. And if you're alive, he says, it's better to smile. So this is the start of the film, in essence. We get the two survivors of Chelmno, and so this is the basis from which Shoah begins. So then we go to more survivors, but from different areas. So we go to two survivors of Vilna in Lithuania. So this is Motke Zaidel and Itzhak Dugin. And we also get a very memorable but short talk from Mr. Zeidel's daughter Hannah, and therefore there we get another aspect in a different area of the world and in the Holocaust, this time in Lithuania. So we go from Chelmno, and then we focus on Lithuania, and then we go from there to I think we go to a Polish. Yes, he is a Polish gentleman. So he was not interned in one of the camps, but he was a quote-unquote a kind of a witness, a Polish villager witness, and his name is Jan Piwonski, and he guides Claude Lanzmann and the interpreter through the forest that surrounded the Sobibor extermination camp, and he very, very memorably talks about the very frightening stories about how there was hunting and how people were hunting men, and how the Germans planted young trees that were 3 years old, and it was very methodically done in order for them to grow in a way that would surround the camp so that it would be hidden. So it was like a screen of trees. Yes, he says, you couldn't guess what had happened here, that these trees hid the secret of a death camp. So this is a Polish witness. So already we're getting a kind of a complicated tapestry here. Not only are we going back and forth between three different areas, we got Chełmno and Vilna, and then now Sobibor, but also we're getting, for the first time, kind of witness testimony from someone who was not a Jewish person in the camp, but rather a witness who was outside the camp, but who was living and working around the camp. Incidentally, Jan Piwonsky, I think, was also he is the assistant switchman, or he described himself as being, he used to work at the train station Sobibor. And therefore, he was very up close to the camp, because the proximity between the Sobibor station and Sobibor camp was quite close. And actually, we get this later in the film when Claude Lanzmann asks him, could you tell me where the fence is? So, and they're at the station. So Mr. Piwonsky very calmly just guides him away from the station, and just a few feet away, and they walks towards the line, and then he says, yes, this is the line where the fence was. So, and then Claude Lanzmann very memorably says, he just walks over that line. He says, so now I'm inside the camp, and he says yes. So this is Jan Piwonsky. So this is already a very interesting thing, because Jan Piwonsky, in this episode and later when he's talking about his experiences at Sobibor station, he is a Polish man, and yet he is, apparently he's given, much time to talk. And from his words and from his testimony, I think we get a sense that he seems to give he appreciates the gravity of the situation, and he appreciates the gravity of the situation as he is recalling these episodes that occurred. And it would seem to us anyway, and probably to Lanzmann himself, that this is a Polish witness that, for all intents and purposes, is one that we can, let's say, quote unquote, sympathize with. So already we have this notion of, let's say, Claude Lanzmann approaching someone from the Polish, the Polish bystander, as it were. And there is a certain amount of, how should I put it, respect that Claude Lanzmann seems to be giving to this particular person, because the way that Mr. Piwonsky is recalling the details of what he saw is quite powerful, and it's given a certain amount of respect that I think is very important. And then that's how the film begins, and then we progress forward with more episodes and more places introduced, and then we are later introduced to the place of Treblinka and certain people who are connected with the camp of Treblinka. So very memorable, we have Richard Glaser, who is speaking from Switzerland, and we also have Abraham Bomba, who is, I think he was first, yes, he was speaking from Israel at first. And then we also get other witnesses. Let's see, we also get Pana Pietria, who is she was living in Auschwitz, and we also get Pan Filipovitz of Vlodava, and we also get, let's see, we also get one more witness, villager. His name is Mr. Falborski, and he is in the village of Kolo. So we are already getting a mixture of witnesses and bystanders here. And we also get one more survivor, whose name is Paula Biren, and she is a survivor from Auschwitz, and she's speaking from Cincinnati, and she speaks in English, and she's very, how should I put it? She is quite, she is very clear in her words. She is very, she speaks with great lucidity, and unfortunately, or I'm not sure, maybe unfortunately is not the right word to use there, but there's only just a couple minutes given to Ms. Paula Beeren with regard to her story of being a survivor in Auschwitz, but we never returned to her story again. But then we do get other villagers and other people who still live in Auschwitz, some of whom are still quite oblivious to the fact that the situation was as grave as it was. I would direct your attention with that particular point to, for example, Pana Pietra and also Mrs. Mikkelsen. Mrs. Mikkelsen was a wife of a Nazi school teacher in Chelmno, and so, she was the one who was having trouble remembering how many Jewish people were exterminated in Chelmno, and she says, for something, or I'm sorry, Claude Lanzmann asks, do you know how many Jews were exterminated there? And she says, for something, 400,000, 40,000. And then Claude Lanzmann corrects her, and he says, 400,000. And then she says, 400,000, yes, I knew it had a 4 in it. Sad, sad, sad. So yes, this is just an example of the testimony of the kind of the villagers and people who lived around or in the towns, and some of them are even now quite, it's amazing how kind of oblivious they are to the gravity of the situation, and that insensitivity shows through in some of their interviews, but I wouldn't say all of them are. There are some people who seem to show a certain sense of understanding of the gravity of the situation, perhaps some more than others, even within that group. So, for example, he was the train driver from the station. Or he was a train driver from the station Treblinka to the camp itself, because there was some distance between the station of Treblinka and the camp. And also he brought cars from certain areas to Treblinka. So he had a kind of a double function. And his name is Henryk Gałkowski. And Henryk Gałkowski had some very interesting points to make. He says, I think he says that there is only a distance of 4 miles between the station of Treblinka and the camp itself. And it was something very interesting. It was a little detail. He was asked if he ever had to drive the trains from the station to the camp, and he said yes. And he's talking about the cars which carried the Jewish people, and they were packed filled with Jewish people. It was horrible. And he says a little detail, which is, I don't know why it's so frightening, but he says, he talks about transporting these cars to the camp, and he says he pushed them. And Claude Lanzmann, you pushed the cars, you didn't pull the cars? And he says, yes, they didn't pull the cars, he pushed the cars. Anyway, then we get more in depth with certain villagers, in and around Treblinka, and also certain villagers in the village of Grabau, which is about 12 miles from Chelmno. So we get this cross-editing, I think, between villagers in Treblinka and villagers in Grabau. And with respect to Treblinka, we get specifically this very memorable man who is a little bit overweight, and he's wearing a red shirt. So his name is Czesław Borowy, and he was a young boy, and he's working on a farm, or he's a farmhand, which was near the train tracks. When the transports would be bringing the truckloads, or the carriages filled with the Jewish people from all over, Europe, they'd be parked in a certain area, and this is where the farm was, where this man, Czeslaw Borowy, was working when he was a young man. And he would be talking about what he saw. And at first, we get a sense of he seemed very sad about the situation, but as the interviews progressed, we get a fuller picture of how Mr. Borowy seems to regard the situation. Even now, it's quite interesting. Because it seems apparent that he even now doesn't necessarily have a sense of how grave the subject matter he is indeed talking about. He's the one who's talking about how he made the gesture, right? The gesture to the Jewish people who were in the cars. And he's from outside. And he's going like this, and this is one of the most ambiguous things of the film. This is something that was spoken of also by Richard Glauser. He was the bearded man who is a survivor of the Treblinka camp. And also, it's a gesture that was made, if you notice, by Henryk Garbowski when the film is charting his it's recreating his trip, his train trip, and he's looking out from the train car, and when the train stops, he does this thing with his hand, and it's quite frightening, actually, the how ambiguous that is even now when we watch it, because are these people really making this gesture because of the reason they say they are, which is namely to warn the Jews, or is there something more evil and malicious in that? Is there a glee in one's eyes when one is making this gesture to a truckload of people who are trapped in these cars, not knowing what their ultimate fate is going to be? So it's quite an ambiguous moment, and it's quite disturbing, actually, and it's just a testament to how remarkable Mr. Lanzmann's skills are as an interviewer, that he was able to capture that particular moment from Mr. Borowy. It was quite revealing, actually, and that goes towards the general thesis of why some people think that this film is, I don't know, it paints a very maybe one-sided picture of the Polish people. And that's certainly true. I think that thesis is certainly it could be supported by the nameless interviewees who are in the village of Grabau, which is near Chełmno. And so we talk about, or we visit people who lived in houses that used to belong to Jewish people, but obviously don't belong to them anymore. And we're talking to some women who are talking about how beautiful the Jewish women were, and they were sort of rivals for the affections of the young men in the area. So, which is quite an interesting a short little exchange. And there's another woman who's being interviewed, and she's saying, because after the Jews left the town, she was able to kind of get a better job. She was able to make a little bit more money selling eggs or something like that, which is kind of it's quite a remarkable statement to make even now, so many years after the fact. It's stunning. It's absolutely stunning. Gosh, it's terrible. And yes, there are some others. There are some other interviews with these other villagers. I wouldn't say that they are all negative. There are some rays of respect and hope amongst these villagers being interviewed. There's one particular gentleman who is nameless, but I think he was a rail worker, and he was talking about how he saw a mother and child. The mother was shot in the heart, and he was quite emotionally moved. It moved him to tears even then, and it was quite traumatic for him to witness. And I find that person to be quite sincere, actually. And other people were talking about how they would try to give water to the Jewish people who were in the cars when the cars were stopped, and sometimes the water, people would give water, but at great risk to themselves, because no one was allowed to give water, lest they incur the wrath of the German or Ukrainian guards. So this was actually quite a dangerous thing that some of the Polish people who were giving water were doing. So if that is indeed a true story, then that is something to be admired and to be lauded. But those accounts. Oh, and I'm sorry. And there are also, as I said before, some villagers in certain areas which are given quite, I think, they're given quite a good degree of respect by Mr. Lanzmann, and I should name those particular those particular villagers right now. So one being Mr. Farborsky from Kolo, and he is the gentleman who's in kind of his house, and he is very calm, and he talks about how, for instance, the Jews were collected in the synagogue in Kolo, and they were then herded off to the nearby camp of Chelmno, and he gives it a sense, you can tell that there is a sense of gravity in his voice, so you know that he seems to realize how grave the situation was. So that's Mr. Farborsky. And then there's also the person who worked at the Sobibor train station, whose name is Jan Piwonski, and he also has a sense of how horrible the situation was. When he's talking to Claude Lanzmann, Claude Lanzmann says, was the weather as beautiful as it was today, or something like that. And then Mr. Piwonski says something very profound. He says, yes, unfortunately, sometimes the days were even better. So that, I think, is a very illuminating statement, because it shows, I think, the depth to which Mr. Piwonski realizes just how serious the situation is. I mean, at least now when he's being interviewed. There's also Mr. Pan Filipovitz from the village of Vlodava. And so Mr. Filipowitz is the gentleman, I think he has a little mustache, and he is being interviewed in the town square somewhere, but he's also in a car with Mr. Lanzmann, and he's driving, and he shows Mr. Lanzmann all the places where a particular Jewish person lived, and it's quite fascinating because he remembers them by name, and there is a certain there is a certain degree of dignity there, I think, because the fact that he remembers the specific Jewish person where he or she lived at the time, and which is, I think, that's something that's quite that's quite interesting. He's talking. Yes, he's very specific. He says, for example, the buildings haven't changed. There were barrels of herrings here, and the Jews sold fish. There were stalls, small shops, Jewish business at the as the gentleman says. That's Baron Holtz's house. He sold wood. Lipschitz's store was there. He sold cloth. This was Lichtenstein's. Over there was a food store, Jewish store. There was a Notion stop here. It sold thread, needles, odds and ends. And there were also 3 barbers, etc., etc. And he's talking about, this house who lived in the house, Bornstein. Yes, he was in the current cement business. He was extremely handsome and very cultivated. Here there was a blacksmith named Tepper. It was a Jewish house. A shoemaker lived here. What was his name? Lanzmann asks, and he replies, Yankel. And then Lanzmann says, you get the feeling that Vlodava was entirely a Jewish city. And Mr. Filipovitz says, yes, because it's true. The Poles lived farther out. The center was wholly Jewish. So there is that's an interesting thing about how he is able to recall these details down to the name of the person. It's quite something, really, if you think about it. If someone remembers the name of a person, so many years after the fact. So that, I think, says a great deal right there, and that would go against the general kind of critique that Lanzmann is painting a sort of a wholly broad brush, which is in effect indicting the Polish population. I don't think that's entirely true because of people like Mr. Filipovitz and Mr. Piwonsky and Farborski and others like that, and others, some of the named unnamed villagers. However, this is counterbalanced by other, perhaps less sympathetic interviewees, such as Mr. Borowy, the man in the red shirt, the farmhand who is in Treblinka. Also, some of the other villagers who are unnamed, and they are talking about the Jewish people in the village of Grabau. So it's a very complicated depiction that is being painted here, but it is quite important to hear. And but that's not all that the film is talking about, at least in this first era. We then get descriptions from Mr. Abraham Bomba and also from Mr. Richard Glauser. Now, Abraham Bomba talks about the arrival at Treblinka camp for the first time, and also the train ride. And the train ride was this hellish thing, where a number of Jewish people died in the train ride to the camps, and then they arrived in the camps. They don't know what's going on, and then they're already the life has changed forever. And Abraham Bomba was. He was talking, for example, about how he had to be in the train, I think, for 24 hours, and that there was no water, there was no food for them to intake, and it was a horrible situation. And he says also something very interesting. He says, when he first arrived at Treblinka, he says, we went into a special barrack where I was sleeping right next to a hallway, and over there that night was the most horrible night for all the people, because of the memory of all those things that people went through with each other, all the joys and the happiness and the births and the weddings and other things, and all of a sudden, in 1 second, to cut through without anything and without any guilt of the people, because the people weren't guilty at all. The only guilt they had was that they were Jewish. Yes. And Richard Glauser, who is also in Treblinka, he says something just so powerful here. He says, he talks about where he was sleeping, and he says, we were put into the barracks. It just had a sand floor, nothing else. Each of us simply dropped where he stood, half asleep. I heard some men hang themselves. We didn't react then. It was almost normal. Just as it was normal that for everyone behind whom the gate of Treblinka closed, there was death. Had to be death, for no one was supposed to be left to bear witness. I already knew that 3 hours after arriving at Treblinka. And with that, Mr. Glauser, I think, just so powerfully describes what the mission statement basically is of the film Shoah, is to show us, to the extent possible, this notion that the Holocaust is death, and it is a particular frightening and just powerful type of death, because it was a death, as Mr. Glauser describes it, of a kind for no one was supposed to be left to bear witness. And that's what I said from the outset, a death which is involving not just the death of a person, but also the complete obliteration and annihilation of the record of that person, in such a way that no trace is left behind, and if no trace is left behind, no witness is left behind to tell the tale after the fact. This is one of the most powerful things in the film, in a film that is already filled with so much power. And, oh gosh, I really, should I go on? There are just so many things here that I could go. Oh yes, of course. Here we get we return very briefly to shots of Germany, and and the reason is because we get a brief testimony from Miss Inga Deutschkron. Now, Inga Deutschkron is one of the few women who is interviewed for Shoah, and who appears in the final cut of Shoah at least. And I understand her to be, she was not rounded up and sent to a camp. Please forgive me if I'm wrong, but at least for most, if not all of the war, she was in hiding, and I think she was in hiding, while other people who were her friends in the Jewish community were rounded up and then transported to a camp. She was hiding in Germany. She was Jewish, but she was hiding in Germany, which in and of itself is quite a harrowing and frightening situation just to even think about. And she was talking about how the Jewish people were rounded up in a dance hall, and then they were later transported out. And the dance hall was called, it was a dance restaurant called Clue, a very big one. And then from there they were deported in various transports. This is terrible. And yes, so this is an interesting point that I should bring up, because Miss Inga Deutschkron and also another woman who appeared earlier in the first era, her name is Paula Biren, who was a survivor of Auschwitz, who now lives in Cincinnati, or at least she did at the time of the filming of her part in Shoah. They are, I think, the only two women survivors they're the only two Jewish women survivors. Of course, there are other women who are interviewed, like Mrs. Mikkelsen, for example, or other villagers and Grabau. But I think as far as the Jewish interviewees are concerned, so far we've only gotten Miss Deutschkron and also Ms. Biren. And this is very interesting because they don't quite appear that often in the film. In fact, Miss Biren, she appeared earlier in the first era, and she doesn't make an appearance ever again in the film. And also that's the same for Ms. Inga Deutschkron right now, who talks about how the Jewish people were rounded up in this Clue restaurant, and then they were transported out, and then she was left behind, and then she went into hiding. But that's it. We don't hear anything more. And so therefore, that's another critique, I think, of the film which can be made, which is this notion of how Lanzmann treats the Jewish women survivors. And perhaps Lanzmann would say that there is no difference, because a survivor is a survivor. It doesn't matter if the survivor is a man or a survivor is a woman. But in actual fact, I would say that if that is indeed his thesis, I would, with great respect, disagree, because it would seem that there were certain aspects of of life in a camp, of life where you're dealing with death. And I think women are discussed in a way that affords them slightly different treatment than men. And so that, I think, is a very interesting aspect, which it would have been, I think, very illuminating if we were able to get more insight from the women survivors. Here's an example. One example being that there's a German, a Nazi, who is being interviewed, and his name is Franz Suchomel. He was, the SS Unterscharführer, and he was stationed at Treblinka. And he was one of the Nazis, or the ex-Nazis, who was filmed with a kind of a hidden camera. And he is the guy who kind of very it's quite disgusting. At one point he is singing a song that was sung at Treblinka, and anyway, at one point, I think it's later, I think it's in the second era actually, where he's talking about how the Jewish people at Treblinka were led to the to their death, right? And so they were led to the gas chambers and then killed, and then they were, anyway. So he was talking about how the Ukrainian guards were there. There was this kind of this. It's not really a tunnel, but it's this little kind of man-made hallway, which was hidden. There was like barbed wire and branches that were woven into this, and they were routed up. It was uphill, and from there, the Jewish people that were selected for death were directed up this tunnel, which was called, the Road to Heaven, some horrible naming like that, or the funnel, I think it was called. Let me get the right thing here. Yes, it was called the funnel or the Road to Heaven. And, according to Franz Suchomel, the Jews called it the Ascension, also the Last Road. But actually, according to Abraham Bomba, the Germans called it the Road to Heaven. So there's a little bit of a discrepancy there. It's also referred to as the funnel or the slouch. So Franz Suchomel is talking about how the Ukrainian guards would whip the men, but they wouldn't whip the women, as a kind of I'm not sure, as a courtesy. I don't know. Is that how you describe that horrible situation? But they would whip the men into the chamber, but the women would stay, and they wouldn't be whipped. All right, and then here's the that's terrible enough, right? But then he's talking about how then Franz Suchomel is talking about how the women would then stand there and be so scared, and they would be naked, and they would be defecating, because this is something that the fear of death happens. And then Franz Suchomel quite disgustingly talks about how it happened to his mother when she was dying. So this is quite horrible, actually. So there's, anyway, I bring it up because it's an example of how women are described. There's other examples. Abraham Bomba earlier in First Era, I think he speaks about how the first night women committed suicide and they killed their children, and then they had poison. There's also remember, there are descriptions of women who are trying to get water. When they're in the trains on their way, I think, to maybe it was Treblinka, and I think was it a woman who threw a pot at a guard, and the guard got so angry that he just shot the car, and there was blood and brains everywhere, according to one witness. There's also the women who were trying to defend themselves, but they were shot and their children were killed. So there are stories of women. Oh, and also there's this idea, I think it was a description in Auschwitz, about how there was a certain policy about not setting in the panic amongst the women, because it was thought amongst the German guards that if that the women in a panic mode would be most difficult to control. So these are just examples of how women are being described. So it's quite clear that there is some distinction, right, between the male prisoners and the female prisoners. So if there's a description, or there's a distinction that is made, at least as described by these witnesses, it's a shame, therefore, that we don't get more female interviewees that were survivors from the Holocaust. I would say also, in part, in the Second Era, we do get some other female perspectives, but they are very few, and it's not so long, unfortunately. So, for example, we do get Ruth Elias, who's talking about she was a Jewish person who was deported from Theresienstadt. So she was in the Theresienstadt family camp in Auschwitz, that was transported to Auschwitz. And so she talks about how she arrived in Auschwitz and she didn't know about Auschwitz, and how the people from the Theresienstadt family camp were treated with a little bit more kind of slightly better conditions than the other people in the camp. And this is just part of the whole picture in that second era of the film, where we get Philipp Müller and Rudolf Verbra talking about they're talking about Auschwitz, and they're talking about the arrival of the Theresienstadt Jews, and how that set the stage for a potential uprising. But unfortunately, it was not meant to be, and therefore Rudolf Bra decides with another a friend of his that he must escape on his own rather than hope for the possibility of an uprising. Anyway, so that is another woman that is being discussed, that is on camera discussing. And then there's also another woman at the end of the film. Her name is Gertrude Schneider, and her mother. They are survivors, I understand, of, I think it's the Warsaw Ghetto. But unfortunately, we don't get anything from them specifically about their experience in the ghetto. We do get a very moving song that they sing, but that's very much it. And in fact, I don't think the mother is named. We do get Gertrude Schneider's name, but we don't get her mother's name. So again, the participants who are women that were survivors of a camp or a ghetto are quite small compared to the number of survivors who were interviewed who were men. And so therefore I think that's another interesting and I think quite reasonable critique to make against the film, not providing enough context for the female Jewish experience in the Holocaust from the perspective of a female survivor. If it was a question of time, then perhaps maybe giving more time to them would have meant taking time away from the other participants like Mr. Philipp Müller or Rudolf Verbra or Abraham Bomba or Richard Glauser, and their stories were quite complete. Or other people maybe once removed like Mr. Jan Karski, etc. So that would have been maybe a certain time constraint. I don't know, but it would have been nice perhaps to see maybe another hour or so devoted to again Miss Inga Deutschkron's story, or Miss Paula Beeren's story, or maybe a Gertrude Schneider's story in the ghetto, but we don't get that. Or Ruth Elias's story. I know she is a Jewish woman from the Theresienstadt who ended up in Auschwitz. So yes, so this is a very valid criticism to make of the film. It's kind of how it treats Jewish female survivors. But again, I don't think that is a major criticism, because it is there is something bigger at play, I would suggest, which is the kind of the overwhelming policy of death against the Jewish population as a whole, not just men, not just women, but the entire Jewish race in Europe, which is the crux of the matter in Shoah. And gosh, I'd like to continue this conversation, if I may, in another video. So let me just stop there, because it is getting long. Just to let you know, I have focused my comments so far primarily on the first era of the film. So perhaps the next video I should focus my comments more primarily on the participants that were interviewed in the second era. So I will do that in another video very soon. In the meantime, and also I should say that I will discuss the release of Shoah by the Criterion Collection in that separate video. I'll talk about what the special features are, etc. But I hope you understand that I wanted to take a lot of time with this, and I'm not finished yet, but I wanted to take a lot of time with this because I think this film is, yes, it is the most important film in the collection, and it is a film that deserves to be watched by everyone. And hopefully from that, maybe certain conversations can come about regarding the film and regarding specific episodes that are spoken about in this film, because it is a crucial part of history, and it is an amazing thing that the film was made, because we are talking about survivors of the Holocaust and witnesses to this history who shouldn't be alive, right? Because of, the chances of them being alive are just so close to zero. It's just, thinking about it now, I can't even begin to imagine just the level of fear and fright that these people must have had. It's just, I can't even. It's it's impossible for me to comprehend. But they are bearing witness as interviewees in Shoah. But they are not the only interviewees, because there are also villagers, and I didn't discuss it in depth here, but there are also key witnesses who are Nazis or former Nazis. So that makes the film quite a complex and difficult one to watch sometimes. But hopefully I will continue the conversation in a separate video very soon. I'm not an expert on Holocaust studies by any means, so please understand that I probably won't be able to answer any questions that one may have about specific aspects of the Holocaust. But to the extent that I'm able to, I'll try to answer any questions that you may have. With that, I'd like to say thank you very much for your time, and I will see you again very soon, where I will discuss more aspects about the film Shoah. Thank you very much.